The office of the large corporation was bustling with activity from the early morning, everyone talking about the new director who had only recently been appointed. Suddenly, that very person appeared in the hallway, overhearing the conversations about him. But instead of being offended, he politely introduced himself to the employees. Nevertheless, the women hurried to justify their behavior, fearing the man's anger. The boss was already waiting for the new president of one of his companies in his office. Yuanli Jiang, as always, arrived rather early and had already greeted the new employee. He was far less courteous to the other person in the room, his son. Yuan Yang himself was far from pleased that he had to come to the office. The company owner considered the new president an excellent man, who, moreover, could teach his son many valuable lessons. The protagonist himself was a modest man and disliked being praised so highly. Still, Yuanli Jiang expressed his trust in him quite openly, for good reason, as he was counting on him to reform his son. The young man didn't like his teacher, though he never showed it openly. Before leaving, the company head ordered Yuan Yang to be diligent and remember the promise he had made to his grandmother before her death, a promise he was now obliged to fulfill. The protagonist suggested they address each other informally, but with this very phrase, he made clear that he was only slightly older than his student. This angered the young man, who couldn't understand why he should show deference to someone much younger than even his father, let alone the other employees. Ultimately, the insolent youth thought he could strike a deal with his teacher so they wouldn't bother each other, but he was mistaken. He couldn't succeed because of the man's strictness. The protagonist reminded the owner's son that his father controlled everything, which meant there was no escaping the lessons, regardless of the mentor. Yet the young man refused to discuss further steps, silently rising from his seat and preparing to leave the office, ignoring the threats. At that moment, Gu Qingpei grabbed him by the shoulder, attempting to stop his departure. This infuriated the former soldier, who couldn't contain himself and gripped his teacher's hand, as if trying to forcefully prove who was in charge, which seemed utterly foolish. In truth, due to his past experiences, the young man simply hated being grabbed from behind and would react aggressively to such actions. The man tried to find out what his student planned to do next, given how repugnant it seemed to him to work in his father's company. The young man, however, openly declared that he didn't want to become a typical office worker. Even though Yuan Yang had grown accustomed to military life, there was no point dwelling on it now. In an attempt to change the subject, the mentor pointed out the young man's attire, which completely violated the company's dress code. Thus, he would need to change his style and also prepare a resume, which the insolent youth didn't even have despite his mature age. The new president then decided to give the young man a tour of the company, much to the owner's son's dismay, further complicating their collaboration. However, avoiding the lessons was impossible as they had been promised to his father. The young man fumed, insisting that all attempts to educate him were utterly futile, even trying to walk away without asking for permission from anyone. Of course, this was a grave mistake, for the protagonist wasn't flustered in the least. He immediately started calling the young man's father to inform him of the situation. Earlier, the man had negotiated with the company owner about educating his son, a task that proved challenging even for someone as experienced as him. Yuanli Jiang didn't want his son to suffer during his training, as military service had already caused him enough hardship, but he agreed to stop funding his excessive spending. Moreover, one of the most critical conditions was that Yuan Yang must not strike his mentor, for if such a thing occurred, he could no longer continue teaching him. Fortunately, the company owner confirmed that his son would not act out in such a way, allowing the mentor to begin his work. Hearing the threat of a call to his father, the young man immediately returned to the office, unwilling to let such a situation unfold. Gu Qingpei smiled with satisfaction, seeing that his methods had proven effective enough to stop the young man's intended escape. However, the young man was so enraged that he grabbed his mentor by the collar and shouted at him to stop threatening him with calls to his father. The protagonist maintained his composure, calmly explaining that he was not at fault, but rather, the company owner was exceptionally skilled at keeping tabs on his son. The only way to put an end to such control was to become a capable employee, so his father could finally trust him and stop monitoring his every move. Yet Yuan Yang remained silent, unwilling to engage in a conversation with his mentor, believing that doing so would mean submitting to him. Eventually, the man suggested they have lunch together to ease the tension between them. He even mentioned a nearby restaurant that served the very cuisine Yuan Yang had grown accustomed to during his military service. This indicated that Gu Qingpei had already studied his protégé's background in great detail, meaning he knew his weaknesses as well. However, the young man wasn't about to surrender so easily and announced that he had invited some friends to join them for lunch, clearly with ulterior motives. The mentor, however, was unfazed and even offered to pay for everyone's meals, ordering extra dishes to ensure there would be enough for all. Suddenly, a group of people entered the restaurant and called out to Yuan Yang, criticizing the place he had chosen among all available options. They were all dressed in military uniforms, clearly continuing their service, unlike the company owner's son. They didn't immediately realize who the man with Yuan Yang was, and were shocked when he introduced himself as their friend's superior. One of the newcomers quickly figured out that Yuan Yang's plan was to intimidate his mentor during lunch, forcing him to give up on the job. The soldier wasted no time, politely greeting the protagonist while gripping his hand excessively hard to show off his strength. Yet the mentor remained calm and even complimented the young man's physical prowess, a reaction that surprised everyone, as most would have responded quite differently. This behavior left the company owner's son's friend bewildered, and he couldn't continue his pressure any further. Instantly changing his demeanor, he returned to his seat and suggested they drink in celebration of such a pleasant meeting. However, Gu Qingpei politely declined, explaining that he had a severe allergy to alcohol, which would cause his skin to break out in unsightly blotches, an embarrassment on his first day at work. This piqued Yuan Yang's curiosity, and he tried to insist that the man share a drink with them, as refusing seemed impolite. Yet, even in this situation, the mentor's impeccable manners allowed him to maintain his dignity, pointing out that if the company of the young soldiers was as excellent as it seemed, even warm water would be enough to make the occasion enjoyable. He expertly raised a toast, expressing his respect for the military personnel, noting that even in peaceful times they ensured the nation's safety. Furthermore, the mentor suggested they all drink tea instead of beer, as it would be better for their health and physical condition. The entire group was stunned by the turn of events. Anyone else would have faltered under such pressure, but this man proved stronger than they had anticipated. To further captivate his audience, Gu Qingpei began speaking of their promising futures, their talents, and even mentioned his knowledge of palmistry. His understanding of such an intriguing subject delighted everyone present, though it only irritated his protege even more. One by one, the soldiers approached the company president, offering their palms to learn about their futures. Yuan Yang realized he couldn't defeat this man with ordinary tactics. Something more drastic would be required. Strangely enough, the soldiers behaved like children around the man, admiring his skills and showing him great respect. In the end, one of Yuan Yang's friends even offered to pay for everyone, despite the mentor's attempts to do so himself. They wanted to do something for the remarkable man who had so effortlessly won the admiration of the military group in just one evening. The soldiers left satisfied, though the same couldn't be said for the company owner's son, who was thoroughly disappointed by the failure of his plan. The mentor remained calm and suggested that Yuan Yang return to work, despite his displeased expression, as their simple lunch had dragged on far too long. The young man expressed his distrust toward his mentor, doubting that his allergy to alcohol was as severe as he had claimed. As it turned out, he had indeed been somewhat deceptive. The allergy wasn't constant, but only flared up at certain times of the year. Unwilling to admit defeat, the company owner's son pretended that the only reason he hadn't mocked his mentor further was because his friends were present. Moreover, he declared that next time he wouldn't offer any such leniency and would undoubtedly win this small war. Naturally, the man understood well that the young man's initial plan was to get him drunk with his friends, hoping to find his weaknesses, but Yuan Yang denied everything. After all, if he admitted his intentions, it would be clear that he had simply been too cowardly to do it alone, an act unworthy of a soldier. In a show of bravado, Yuan Yang expressed a desire to personally challenge his mentor in a test of alcohol tolerance. However, there was no time for that now. They had to return to the office, and they still needed to stop by the lounge as the director's clothes smelled of food and needed to be changed before the meeting. At first, Yuan Yang grew wary when his mentor began to remove his clothes, finding the situation odd. But after a quick explanation, he realized his concerns were misplaced. Not wanting to listen to the young man's grumbling, the mentor suggested he head to the conference room early and wait for the meeting to start. However, the young man wasn't ready to back down so easily, catching up to the protagonist and grabbing him by the collar, once again attempting to threaten him. He believed that, given his status as the owner's son, no one had the right to treat him like a subordinate, and his anger only intensified. Yet, considering the circumstances, the protagonist could have easily calmed the insolent youth with his own threats, as the entire situation bordered on inappropriate behavior. The only thing required of the young man during his training was to follow the company director's instructions, but even that he found impossible to do. Though this irritated Yuan Yang, he eventually let go of the director and allowed him to finally change clothes, settling himself on a sofa at the other end of the room. The protagonist took this as a good sign and resumed his attempts to teach the impudent young man some moral lessons, trying to make him reflect on whether he could truly manage the company if he inherited it. However, Yuan Yang wanted nothing to do with the company, attending only because of a promise he had made to his grandmother. In fact, Yuan Yang wasn't even required to work here, as his promise was merely to leave the military, meaning he could choose any career. During his time at the company, the young man continued to shirk all responsibilities, claiming that by doing so, he would avoid causing any problems. Yet, the protagonist knew perfectly well that he was responsible for the heir's success or failure, and the only advice he could offer to avoid the situation was to appeal directly to his father. Clearly unwilling to do that, the young man fell silent at the mention of such an unpleasant option. The mentor, now seeing his protégé's face in a calmer state, realized that he was quite a handsome individual. The mentor quickly changed clothes, gathered the necessary documents, and called Yuan Yang to join him for the meeting, which was about to begin. At first, the young man tried to ignore his boss's words, still not wanting to participate in any company matters, but resistance was futile. Despite all his negative emotions, he had no choice but to rise from the comfortable sofa and follow his mentor. Together, they entered the conference room, both looking rather serious, with the former soldier even appearing somewhat intimidating. The employees greeted the new director, eager to earn his favor from day one, hoping to ensure a comfortable working relationship. Gu Qingpei was also cordial with his subordinates, but maintained proper hierarchy, politely introducing himself and motivating everyone for the productive work ahead. The women whispered among themselves about the new company president, finding him quite handsome, which only irritated the owner's son even more. The mentor continued his speech, capturing everyone's attention, openly admitting that he had just started at this location and hoped for the team's support. Everyone appreciated his words, for if the company owner had chosen him, then he must be deserving of respect and even obedience. He decided to begin changes in the company by introducing rules to ensure discipline and order in every workspace, an essential foundation for future success. Drafts of the new regulations were distributed to everyone, but as soon as Yuan Yang received his, he immediately tore it up without even attempting to read it. Seeing this, the protagonist quickly reminded him that any violation of the rules would now result in fines. Every employee would now have to comply with the listed standards, which included behavior and appearance, and most people were pleased, even impressed by the director's firmness. However, as the meeting ended and many began to head home, the man noticed that his assistant was also trying to sneak away. Leaving the workplace was strictly prohibited, so the mentor hurried to stop the defiant young man, though the latter protested against it all. The young man had entirely different plans. He wanted to go home and finally get some proper sleep, paying no mind to his boss's prohibitions. Nevertheless, the mentor tried to stop him, reminding him of the new rules that he had to follow just like everyone else, to avoid facing a fine. Moreover, the mentor simply couldn't allow his student to leave, as his father would immediately find out, which would become a significant issue for both of them. The man was too responsible, viewing his work as a critical part of his life, always striving to do his best. Furious, the former soldier grabbed Gu Qingpei by the collar and raised his fist, as if about to make the fatal mistake of striking his mentor. Surprisingly, the man showed no fear, knowing he had leverage over the insolent young man, and immediately warned him that if he dared strike his mentor, his father would find out about the outburst. Furious, the former soldier shoved him against the wall, calling his threats cowardly, something unworthy of an honorable fight. He even wished his family would abandon the idea of preparing him to run the company, as per the mentor's advice. But the latter had no intention of helping with that. It was time to return to the company president's office to continue working, though the young man, of course, had no intention of doing so. Slumping onto the sofa, Yuan Yang declared he was tired and wanted to sleep, even going so far as to prop his feet on the coffee table, displaying a complete lack of manners. In response, the mentor suggested he go to the lounge, as he still had an hour and a half left on his break to get some rest. Naturally, the young man didn't refuse, seeing it as a chance to spend some time alone, avoiding the unpleasant company of his superior. Meanwhile, the protagonist remained in the office, settling into his chair and contemplating what the results of the young man's training would be in a few days. However, to ensure the efforts wouldn't be in vain, the mentor decided to ask the company owner whether his son had any additional sources of income. It turned out the young man had a small business, which was failing, and his father had made sure it was no longer generating any profit. This was a good thing, as it would force the young man to understand the value of the salary he earned at the company and motivate him to avoid fines for breaking the rules. The mentor found it quite amusing to imagine the sadness in his protégé's eyes at the absence of the large sums he had grown accustomed to seeing in his accounts. 4 hours passed, yet Yuan Yang hadn't returned from the lounge, which seemed strange and even impossible, as no one usually slept that long during the day. Thus, the protagonist went to check on him, feeling no hesitation in opening the door to find out what was happening. The company owner's son lay in bed shirtless, as if he were in his own home, completely unconcerned about anyone seeing him. The mentor blushed slightly at the sight, as the young man was indeed in excellent physical shape, a clear result of his military service. Expressing his obvious displeasure at such behavior, the mentor remarked that too much time had passed for him to still be resting so comfortably. However, the young man merely turned away and told him to leave, insisting that he wanted to continue his nap in the cozy bed. The problem, of course, was that this room was reserved for the company president, meaning Yuan Yang had, in fact, taken over his boss's bed. The mentor approached from behind, intending to wake him with a touch on the back, but before he could even reach him, he was met with aggression. The former soldier boldly pinned the mentor to the bed, nearly punching him in the face, a clear display of disrespect. This happened solely because the mentor had again approached him from behind, forgetting the warning not to do so. Now, Yuan Yang refused to let him go, even joking that they could have a sparring match to improve each other's physical conditioning. In truth, it was more of a taunt, as the young man knew full well that someone as physically weak as his mentor stood no chance against a man who had spent years in the military. As if unfazed by the son's anger, the protagonist calmly asked if he could count on a position once the young man took over the company. After all, without him, the future director might grow bored sitting alone at his desk, but such comments only infuriated the young man further, who already hated discussing the future. The former soldier once again hinted at his superior physical strength, emphasizing that resisting him in that moment was utterly futile. Yet, even in such a tense situation, the protagonist's quick thinking allowed him to escape the awkward encounter. He struck at his opponent's weak spot, forcing him to stand up. Wen Yang responded by openly spewing vulgar insults, trying to leave the man even more stunned. Nevertheless, the mentor persisted, lecturing the young man that his break had long since ended, and he was now late for work. This only aggravated Yuan Yang further. He was barely holding back from striking his boss, frustrated that the man wouldn't stop trying to teach him. It was clear that, for now, he couldn't do much to challenge Gu Qingpei, but he threatened that one day he'd make the mentor regret ever taking on this job. What irritated the company heir most was the director's outwardly kind treatment of him, as it was clearly not genuine. Yet the former soldier finally let the mentor go, and Gu Qingpei, maintaining his composure, thanked him for the appropriate warning, as if he hadn't been angered at all. Deciding to play along with Yuan Yang's rules, the mentor promised to continue behaving in exactly the way that irritated him the most. The heir couldn't understand why, after an entire day, he had been unable to force his mentor to quit the job his father had given him. Moreover, Gu Qingpei once again reminded him that the lunch break was limited in time, and if he returned late, he would face a fine. However, the young man, still unaware that his only source of income would now be his company's salary, boldly claimed that he didn't need money. Instead, the insolent youth suggested the mentor work for him once his father inevitably fired the man for not handling him properly. The director kept his composure as best he could, but was already secretly relishing the moment when his student would learn that he was no longer wealthy. He even agreed to the young man's hypothetical job offer, expressing hope that it wouldn't be the last position he'd manage under Yuan Yang's leadership. Then, with an unflappable demeanor, he ordered his subordinate to drive him home, shocking the company heir. Yuan Yang was furious, unable to understand how an able-bodied adult couldn't know how to drive a car. Moreover, he was used to driving military vehicles and couldn't comprehend why he now had to play chauffeur for his mentor. All of his frustrations should have been directed solely at his father, who had hired the teacher. Gu Qingpei was merely executing his orders. Besides, the company car promised to him wasn't ready yet, meaning he had no choice but to provide transportation himself for now. And since Yuan Yang was so eager to get home, it was unclear why he was wasting time protesting so loudly. Finally, Yuan Yang agreed, but only on the condition that his passenger refrained from commenting on his driving style. To his surprise, the mentor chose to sit in the front seat, though most people with a personal driver preferred to ride in the back, as the young man had expected. In truth, Gu Qingpei had never ridden in large military-style vehicles before, so he was curious to see the view through the front windshield. Surprisingly, the drive was calm and rather slow, though the protagonist had expected a more reckless ride from the defiant young man. However, due to heavy traffic, it was impossible to speed up, and they had to slow down like the rest of the cars on the road. Gu Qingpei tried to invite his assistant to grab a bite to eat, but the young man remained silent, unwilling to accept the offer. The mentor then suggested they stop to buy a suit, reminding him that wearing casual clothes to work was not allowed and could result in a fine. At this, the young man became even more furious, having never imagined he'd be following this man's orders even outside of work hours. Yen Yang, however, was acting worse than a child, constantly throwing tantrums and refusing to complete even the simplest tasks. Still, the young man believed he could surprise his mentor in unpleasant ways and openly declared that there was much Gu Qingpei didn't know about him. Soon, they arrived at the shopping mall where the former soldier ordered his mentor to get out of the car in a commanding tone. They entered the suit store, and the young man, refusing to try anything on, simply demanded that they wrap up whatever was available in his size. However, the consultant insisted against buying blindly and persuaded him to at least try on one suit, eventually convincing him to do so. It was such a struggle that the employee barely held back from snapping at the customer, but reminded herself just in time that the customer is always right. Soon, the young man emerged from the fitting room in a new look. He looked stunning in the black suit, as though he already belonged in the company's top management. Yet, he himself disliked the appearance, being accustomed to completely different attire, and wasn't shy about voicing his discontent. Nevertheless, he had no other choice, as such outfits were now mandatory for work, so he asked them to pack the items that fit him. As this was happening, Yuan Yang grew more and more frustrated, not wanting to spend his money on such clothes, especially since his boss reminded him that he'd need to use his company-earned salary to pay for them. This meant that if they bought the suit, there wouldn't be enough left for a shirt, a clear sign that the wealthy heir wasn't used to paying attention to prices. Meanwhile, the mentor asked to see suits for himself, as he had worked hard and could afford more purchases. With his refined manners, each style the consultant suggested suited him perfectly. It was impossible to choose just one, so he bought all that he tried on. The store staff were thrilled with such a customer, but the company heir was still irritated by his mentor's pompousness, though his courtesy toward others continued to win people over. Later, the mentor once again invited his protégé to have lunch together, noting that he was surely hungry and probably didn't have enough money to pay for his own meal. However, this only enraged the young man further, convinced that his mentor's offer was just a display of arrogance, a feeling fueled by their differing social statuses. In reality, the mentor simply wanted to build a connection with Yuan Yang and support him, trying to avoid any extreme aggression when the young man learned that his accounts were blocked. Still, the young man refused to engage, keeping his distance from his boss, making it clear that persuading him was pointless. Before getting out of the car, the mentor reminded the company owner's son of their workday's start time and when he was expected to pick him up in the morning. They would need to arrive at the office fairly early, as the mentor liked to have breakfast there, meaning they would need to manage everything before work began. Additionally, the mentor intentionally gave him an earlier time, knowing that the young man would likely struggle to wake up on time and reach the president's house without being late. Fortunately, Yuan Yang lived nearby and would have no trouble making it in time the next morning, though he wasn't eager to do so. Gu Qingpei decided to give his assistant some extra work, asking him to help carry the bags containing all his evening purchases. While the young man didn't outright protest, he was still seething inside, unable to believe he was being forced to follow such orders as part of his training. It turned out Yuan Yang had no idea what a company director's assistant and driver were actually responsible for, which explained his fury at every command. The protagonist didn't want to keep listening to his constant complaints. Though he found them rather endearing, it was still incredibly frustrating. As they entered the foyer, the company owner's son immediately noticed how cold and unwelcoming the place felt, as if it had been vacant for a long time. From this, he deduced that his mentor was lonely, and he wasn't wrong. The man confirmed that he hadn't yet had the chance to start a family, This wasn't surprising, considering his difficult personality, making it unlikely that any woman would want to stay with him for life. Gu Qingpei once again invited his subordinate. The mentor himself made a point of returning to his family as frequently as possible, considering it both honorable and proper. The company heir didn't want to discuss such personal matters with an outsider and firmly asked him to drop the subject. The young man was increasingly irritated by his boss's constant chatter. He never stayed quiet, as if he didn't know how, always asking questions about everything. At times, the temptation to use force to silence the mentor even briefly was strong, but such actions were strictly forbidden. Later, as Yuan Yang sat in the office, he received a call from his best friend, whom he hadn't seen in a long time. Hearing that the former soldier was working, his friend immediately assumed that Yuan Yang had returned to the army, laughing at the idea. However, things were far less pleasant for the wealthy heir, as he had been forced to do something he detested, work in his father's company. His friend took this news with irony, but Yuan Yang quickly made it clear that he didn't plan to stay long, despite his father's intentions of assigning him a mentor. The friend offered to help Yuan Yang deal with this unpleasant figure, but the young man declined, having promised his father not to use force against him. Still, the friend was confident Yuan Yang would find a way. He had always been persistent in such matters. Frustrated, the wealthy heir angrily threw his phone, cutting off the call, but soon received a message inviting him to have some fun that evening. Wanting to escape from everything going on around him, Yuan Yang put on his headphones and started watching videos on his phone while he had the chance. However, it wasn't long before Gu Qingpei approached, yanked on the headphone cord, forcing the young man to pay attention to him, and even threatened to damage the device if he didn't get back to work. It turned out the young man had forgotten to clock in upon arriving at the office, which meant it would be counted as a late arrival and subject to a fine. Yuan Yang flew into a rage, yelling at his boss. He was fed up with being constantly reprimanded for every little mistake. As always, the mentor remained calm, reminding him without anger that he was currently increasing the fine even further, which would be deducted from his paycheck. Working in an office required following rules that were standard there and respecting the authority of the management. Each word only fueled the young man's anger further. He was ready to break his promise and attack the director right then and there, though he struggled to hold himself back.